rancher thought he won a grand prize, until he realized it was a captive Apache woman needing rescue. John Fletcher had spent his entire life on the wide, sun-baked plains of the Southwest. He had always loved the land and the animals that roamed it, learning from his father how to care for cattle, repair fences, and ride the dusty trails that wound through their ranch. Life was not easy, but it was honest. Every morning he woke before sunrise, pulling on worn boots and a hat that had seen better days, ready to face whatever the day might bring. He didn't crave excitement or fortune. He simply wanted to do his work well and provide for himself and the small community that surrounded him. Over the years, John had developed a reputation as a skilled rancher. His cattle were strong, healthy, and well-fed. Neighbors often came to him for advice, and sometimes when he had extra time, he helped others with their herds. Despite the hard work, John found satisfaction in the quiet rhythm of ranch life. The sound of hooves on dirt, the wind rustling through the dry grass, and the occasional laughter of a friend stopping by for a visit. Yet deep inside there was a small part of him that wished for recognition, a little acknowledgement for the effort he put into his life and work.
One summer, the county announced its annual livestock fair.
It was a tradition that went back decades, a place where ranchers could showcase their finest cattle, win prizes, and celebrate their hard work. John had never participated in such events before, preferring the solitude of the ranch to the noise of crowds. But this year felt different. Perhaps it was the quiet ambition he had nurtured for so long, or perhaps it was the encouragement of his friends, who insisted he deserved recognition. Whatever the reason, John decided to enter the fair with his prized bull, a strong, sleek animal he had raised since it was a calf. The weeks leading up to the fair were busy. John worked tirelessly, grooming his cattle, feeding them the best hay, and training them to respond to commands. Every evening he would stand in the corral brushing the bull's coat until it shone in the setting sun. He whispered words of encouragement to the animal, speaking as if it could understand him, and in a way, it did. The bond between John and his cattle was strong, built on years of patience, care, and shared days under the blazing sun. His friends noticed the dedication and teased him gently, saying that he might just win the grand prize this year. John chuckled at their jokes but secretly hoped they were right. Finally, the day of the fair arrived. The county fairgrounds were alive with energy, children running between stalls, vendors calling out their goods, and ranchers proudly leading their animals into the exhibition rings. The smell of fresh hay mixed with the aroma of roasted food from nearby stands. Music played from a small stage and laughter echoed across the open fields. John felt a mixture of nerves and excitement as he led his bull into the judging area. He adjusted the hat on his head, wiped his hands on his jeans, and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. The judges moved carefully among the animals, inspecting each one with practiced eyes. They examined coats, muscle tone, and overall health, jotting notes on small clipboards. John watched silently, heart pounding, as they circled his bull. He whispered to the animal, telling it to stand tall to show its strength, and the bull seemed to respond, standing with quiet dignity. The minutes felt like hours, and when the judges finally stepped back and whispered among themselves, John's stomach twisted in anticipation. When the announcement came, John could hardly believe it. His name was called. He had won the grand prize. A surge of pride and joy coursed through him. He imagined the shiny trophy, the certificate, and the small cash prize that would help with supplies on the ranch. People clapped and cheered, patting him on the back. For a moment he felt like all his hard work had been recognized, and a bright smile spread across his face. But then came the moment that changed everything. The prize was not a trophy or money. It was something, or rather, someone, completely unexpected. A woman was brought forward, standing nervously in a small enclosure. John blinked, certain he must be misunderstanding. The crowd continued to cheer, but their celebration now seemed confusing, almost eerie. The woman's clothes were dusty and worn, her eyes wide and cautious. She held herself stiffly, as if unsure whether to trust the people around her. John stepped closer, heart racing. He had seen many people in his life, but nothing like this. There was something about her that immediately drew his attention, an intensity in her gaze, a quiet strength mixed with vulnerability. He wanted to speak, to understand what was happening, but the crowd's excitement made it impossible to think clearly. People were laughing, clapping, and taking pictures, but John felt a cold knot of unease tighten in his chest. He approached one of the fair organizers, a middle-aged man with a nervous smile, and asked quietly, "What's going on here? Is this part of the prize?" The man shrugged and muttered something about a heritage display and local traditions. John frowned. The explanation made no sense to him. His prize, a living person. That couldn't be right. Something felt very wrong. He glanced at the woman again. She didn't smile or acknowledge the crowd. Her eyes flicked toward him briefly, and for a moment, John thought he saw a glimmer of hope, a silent plea for help. The celebration continued, but John felt like he was seeing it through a haze. He had won a grand prize, yes, but the nature of that prize was confusing and disturbing. People around him were clapping, but their joy felt hollow, almost cruel. He realized with a sinking feeling that the woman might not be there by choice. The thought made his stomach churn. After the initial excitement died down, John found a quiet corner near the enclosure. He watched the woman, noticing how she flinched at sudden movements and avoided eye contact with anyone except him. He spoke softly, trying to get her attention without startling her. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond, but her eyes lingered on him for a brief moment, before darting away. John's mind raced. He had entered the fair hoping for recognition, maybe even a small victory, but now he faced something entirely unexpected. He knew he couldn't ignore it. The responsibility weighed on him heavily. This was no longer about prizes or accolades. It was about a human being, someone who might need help. As he stood there, considering his next steps, John felt a mixture of fear and determination. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the fairgrounds. The woman remained in the enclosure, quiet but alert. John understood that whatever happened next would change his life forever. He had stepped into the fair hoping to be celebrated for his hard work, but instead, he had been confronted with a situation that required courage, empathy, and careful judgment. And in that moment, John Fletcher realized that winning a grand prize might not be about trophies at all. Sometimes it meant seeing something no one else noticed, stepping forward when others hesitated, and facing the unknown with a steady heart. He didn't yet know the full story of the woman before him, but he knew one thing clearly. He could not walk away. John Fletcher could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The excitement of winning the grand prize had faded, replaced by a heavy knot of unease. The woman in the enclosure was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Her eyes were alert, scanning the crowd nervously, but she did not meet the eyes of anyone except him. Even then, it was only for brief moments. John felt a mixture of curiosity and concern. He knew he had to understand what was happening, but he also understood that the situation was delicate. One wrong move, and he could make things worse for her. He approached the fair organizer again, this time with a firmer voice. "I need to know what's going on here," John said, keeping his tone calm. "Is this really a prize? How did this happen?" The man shifted uneasily, avoiding John's gaze. "It's part of the display, it's tradition," he stammered. "People come to see it. And, well, it's a special feature this year." John frowned. Tradition? Special feature? The word sounded hollow, even ridiculous, when he looked at the woman. There was no hint of consent in her demeanor. She did not smile, she did not bow, and she did not acknowledge the cheering crowd. Her posture was tense, her hands lightly bound with a thin rope. Something in John's gut told him that she was not there willingly. He stepped closer to her enclosure, speaking softly, so that only she could hear. "It's okay," he said gently. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." The woman flinched at his words, but she did not turn away entirely. Her eyes lingered on him for a fraction of a second longer than before, as if she recognized some hint of trust in his tone. John held that moment, realizing it might be the only opportunity to connect with her without alarming her further. Around him, the crowd continued to cheer and clap. Some were taking pictures, others were whispering excitedly. But John felt a sharp contrast to their joy. To him, the scene felt wrong, uncomfortable, almost cruel. He had always believed in treating people with respect, in standing up for what was right, and in helping those who could not help themselves. That belief was now being tested in a way he had never imagined. He decided to spend the rest of the day observing her quietly, noting her movements, her reactions, and any signs that might indicate how she came to be in the situation. She remained silent, and John wondered if she was too frightened to speak, or if she simply did not trust anyone. He thought back to the stories his father had told him about the history of the region, the conflicts, the hardships, and the many injustices faced by the native communities over the years.
Could her presence be related to some old pattern of exploitation?
The thought made his chest tighten. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, John noticed something else. The woman's hands were not just idle. They moved in small, careful ways. She adjusted the rope around her wrists, tested its tightness, and seemed to be searching for a chance to escape. He realized that she had been trained to endure, to hide her fear, and perhaps to obey commands that she did not wish to follow. The more John watched, the more certain he became that she was a captive, forced into this display against her will. By late afternoon, the fair had become more crowded, and the organizers seemed increasingly impatient. John sensed that he had to act carefully. He could not confront them directly without risking her safety, yet he also could not leave her there. He needed information before taking any action. Quietly, he began asking subtle questions to vendors and other fair participants, speaking in a calm, casual manner so as not to attract attention. Most people were oblivious or offered vague, unhelpful answers, but a few noticed the tension in his voice and shared small hints about the special prize being controversial. One vendor, a middle-aged woman selling handmade crafts, leaned in and whispered, "That girl, she's not really part of the fair. I've seen her before, being moved around from place to place. Something isn't right." John thanked her quietly and made a mental note of her words. The pieces were beginning to fit together, painting a disturbing picture. He now felt an even stronger resolve to help her. He realized that this situation required careful planning. Acting impulsively could put both of them at risk. He had to think several steps ahead. When the fair started to close for the day, John stayed behind while most people left. The crowd thinned, and the organizers began to pack up, assuming the day's events had concluded successfully. John took this opportunity to speak to the woman more directly, keeping his voice low and calm. "You don't have to be afraid," he said. "I'm here to help. Can you tell me your name?" For a long moment there was only silence. Then, in a barely audible whisper, she said, "Mika. My name is Mika." Her voice was soft, almost breaking, but it carried a quiet strength. John nodded, acknowledging her courage.
Mika, my name is John. You're safe with me. I promise we'll figure this out together. Mika flinched again but did not retreat.
Her eyes showed a mixture of fear and relief, as if she had been waiting for someone trustworthy to appear. John realized that establishing trust was the first step. He had no idea how long she had been through this ordeal, how much fear and uncertainty she carried, but he knew that he could not force her to do anything. He had to let her guide the pace of their interactions, to let her know that he respected her autonomy and would not harm her. As evening approached, John made a decision. He could not leave Mika alone at the fair, and he could not allow her to be taken away or moved without understanding her situation. He resolved to find a safe place where she could rest, eat, and feel secure. He approached the organizers one last time, asking if he could take her temporarily for a short period, claiming that it was part of a private cultural experience to avoid arousing suspicion. To his relief, they agreed, likely seeing it as a harmless gesture that fit into their display. John led Mika to the edge of the fairgrounds, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. He offered her a small bottle of water and some bread he had brought from home. She hesitated at first, then took the items slowly, as if testing whether she could trust him. John waited patiently, allowing her to eat and drink at her own pace. He spoke softly, telling her about the ranch, the animals, and the quiet life he lived. The words were meant not only to distract her but also to create a sense of normalcy and safety, something she had likely not experienced in a long time. Throughout the evening, John kept a careful watch, making sure that no one was observing them too closely. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had never faced anything like this before, and yet he knew instinctively that turning away was not an option. Mika had been entrusted to him, whether by fate or circumstance, and he intended to do everything in his power to protect her. By the time the fairgrounds were nearly empty, Mika had begun to relax slightly. Her posture was still cautious, but she no longer flinched at every movement. She even allowed John to guide her a few steps away from the enclosure, trusting him just enough to follow his lead. John could see the faintest hint of relief in her eyes, a fragile spark of hope that he vowed to nurture. As they walked toward the nearby ranch where he planned to keep her temporarily, John reflected on the day's events. What had started as a simple ambition to win recognition for his work had turned into something far greater and far more complicated. He had been faced with a moral choice, one that required courage, patience, and careful judgment. The experience had opened his eyes to the realities that many people ignored or overlooked, the dangers faced by those who were vulnerable, the cruelty that sometimes hid behind tradition or spectacle, and the quiet strength of individuals like Mika who endured unimaginable hardship with dignity. By the time they reached a quiet spot near the edge of the plains, the sky was painted in shades of deep orange and purple. John looked at Mika and said softly, "We'll get through this. You're safe now and I'll help you however I can." She nodded slightly, a small but significant gesture of trust. John knew that this was only the beginning of a long journey, but he also knew that he would not falter. He had faced fear and uncertainty, and he had chosen to act with compassion and determination. That choice, he realized, was more important than any prize or recognition he could ever receive. Once they were away from the crowded fairgrounds, John Fletcher guided Mika to a quiet corner near the edge of his property, where the sun dipped low over the horizon and the air was cooler than it had been in the heat of the day. He led her to a small old barn he had repaired for storage, which now served as a temporary shelter. Inside it was simple but safe, a straw mat, a blanket he had washed just the day before, and a few lanterns to provide soft light. John gestured toward the mat and spoke gently. "You can sit here."
I'll get you some water and food. Take your time.
"No one will bother you here." Mika hesitated, standing at the entrance, her eyes scanning the shadows of the barn as if she expected someone to appear and drag her away. John waited patiently, making no sudden movements. He did not press her to sit or speak. He simply stood quietly, offering her the reassurance of presence without force. After several long minutes, she slowly lowered herself onto the mat, her posture tense but slightly more relaxed than before. She wrapped the thin blanket around her shoulders and allowed herself a small sip of water, as though testing the safety of this strange new environment. John watched her closely, noting every subtle gesture, every fleeting expression. He had spent hours thinking about the fair, the crowd, and the strange announcement of the prize. Now, with Mika alone and vulnerable, he understood more clearly the weight of what had occurred. Something terrible had brought her here, something that had forced her into a situation no one should ever endure. And he realized that he could not rest until he understood the full truth. "Can you tell me what happened?" he asked softly, sitting on a crate nearby so as not to intimidate her. "How did you come to be at the fair? You don't have to tell me everything if you're not ready, but I want to help." Mika looked at him for a long time, her eyes wide and cautious. Then, in a low, shaky voice, she began to speak.
I was taken from my home," she whispered. "It's been a long time."
"I don't know why they brought me here. They said I had to follow the rules or there would be consequences." Her hands trembled slightly as she held the blanket tighter around herself. John listened silently, feeling a mixture of sorrow and determination swell in his chest. He could see that Mika had been through a great deal of fear and uncertainty. Her voice was soft, but there was a quiet strength behind it. She had endured hardships most people could never imagine, and yet she was still alert, still aware of her surroundings, still holding on to a fragile sense of self, John realized that she had survived by being careful, by observing, and by trusting no one. And now, somehow, she had to decide whether she could trust him. "Do you know who brought you here?" John asked gently, keeping his tone calm and steady. "Did they do this to you before?" Mika shook her head slightly. "I don't know their names. I've seen many people like them. They move around, taking people, forcing them into displays. I've learned to stay quiet. If I speak, they punish me. If I try to escape, I get hurt." Her voice broke for a moment, and John could see the memory of past fear reflected in her eyes. He felt a surge of protectiveness. He knew he had to act carefully, but he also knew he could not leave her in this situation. John nodded, letting her know that he understood. "You're safe now," he said firmly. "No one is going to hurt you here. I'll make sure of that." Mika glanced at him, a flicker of hope in her gaze. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough for John to grasp. He realized that trust was fragile, especially for someone who had endured captivity and fear for so long. He could not rush her. He had to earn that trust through patience, understanding, and careful action. For the next few hours, John stayed with her, talking quietly about the ranch, the animals, and the open fields that stretched for miles around. He shared stories of his life, of the cattle he had raised, and the quiet pleasures of working on the land. The purpose was simple: to create a sense of normalcy, a temporary feeling of safety that Mika had likely never experienced before. Slowly she began to relax, leaning back slightly on the mat and listening to his stories.
As night fell, John realized that he needed to plan the next steps.
He could not leave Mika at the fairgrounds or return her to the organizers. They would surely move her again, or force her into another display. She needed protection, and he needed help. John thought carefully about who he could trust: friends, local authorities, anyone who could assist in ensuring Mika's safety. He knew it would not be easy, but he also knew that doing nothing was not an option. The first challenge, John realized, was information. He needed to understand who had brought Mika here, why, and what their next moves might be. He began to ask her gently about any details she could remember: names, places, sounds, or even small habits that might identify her captors. Mika spoke slowly, hesitantly, but she began to recount fragments of her experience. She spoke of being moved from town to town, of strict rules and harsh punishments, and of moments when she had felt utterly alone. John listened with a heavy heart but also with determination. Every detail she shared could help protect her and bring justice to those responsible. John also realized that Mika's cultural background was important. She was Apache, and her family and community had likely been searching for her for a long time. He felt a sense of responsibility not only to protect her physically but also to honor her heritage and help her reconnect with her people when the time was right. He knew that her story was bigger than just the events of the fair. It was connected to a long history of survival, resilience, and the struggle for dignity. Over the course of the night, John and Mika developed a careful routine. He brought her food, fresh water, and blankets, and he spoke to her gently, giving her the space to respond in her own time. Mika began to ask questions too, about the ranch, the animals, and the quiet life that John lived. She was cautious but curious, testing the boundaries of her newfound safety. John answered her questions honestly, keeping his tone calm and reassuring. By morning, John had made a decision. He could not keep Mika hidden indefinitely, and he could not face her captors alone if they tried to reclaim her. He needed allies, people who could help ensure her safety and hold those responsible accountable. He thought about the local sheriff, a man he trusted, and a few friends who had experience with law enforcement. He planned to reach out discreetly, explaining the situation and requesting assistance without putting Mika at further risk. Before taking any action, John spent the day observing the surrounding area. He watched for signs of the organizers or anyone connected to Mika's captivity. He noted the movements of vehicles, listened to the sounds of the nearby roads, and planned possible escape routes should danger arise. Every step was measured and deliberate. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him, but he also felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. This was no longer about cattle or recognition. This was about protecting a life, restoring dignity, and standing up for what was right. Throughout the day, Mika grew more comfortable with John's presence. She moved more freely, spoke in short sentences, and even smiled faintly at some of his stories. John knew that trust had to be earned slowly, and he was patient. He also understood that the road ahead would be difficult. They would need courage, strategy, and careful planning to ensure her safety and bring her captors to justice. But for the first time in a long while, Mika had a chance to feel safe, and John had a clear purpose that went beyond the ordinary life of a rancher. By evening, John and Mika were ready to take the next step. They had gathered enough information to understand the immediate dangers, and John had identified a small group of trusted allies who could assist. The night was quiet, the stars bright above the wide plains. John felt a mixture of anticipation and determination. He knew that the coming days would be challenging, but he also knew that doing nothing was not an option. Mika's freedom, her safety, and her dignity depended on careful, courageous action. As they sat together in the barn, John placed a reassuring hand on Mika's shoulder. "We're going to get through this," he said softly. "I promise you, you won't be alone anymore. We'll find a way to make sure you're safe, and we'll stop anyone who tried to hurt you." Mika looked at him, her eyes reflecting both fear and hope. For the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she could be free. And in that quiet moment, John Fletcher understood the truth of what he had learned over the past day. Courage was not just about facing danger. It was about standing with someone in need, listening to their story, and taking action when others might look away. He had never imagined that entering a fair to showcase his cattle would lead him to this moment. But now, with Mika by his side, he knew that his life, and hers, would never be the same. John Fletcher knew that time was critical. Mika's captors were still out there, and any delay could put her back in danger. Over the previous days, he had gathered information, observed patterns, and considered every possible risk. Now, it was time to act. The plan had to be careful, precise, and discreet. There was no room for mistakes. He spent the morning preparing supplies. He packed blankets, food, water, and a small first aid kit. He also brought ropes, lanterns, and a few tools he thought might be useful for getting through locked gates or obstacles. Every item was carefully considered. John knew that the rescue would require both stealth and speed. He double-checked everything, making sure nothing was forgotten. Mika watched quietly, curiosity and nervousness in her eyes. She trusted John enough to follow his lead, but she remained cautious, aware that danger could be anywhere. Once the preparations were complete, John reviewed the plan in his mind. He would first travel to the edge of the fairgrounds under the cover of darkness, when the crowd had long since left and the guards were fewer. He would use side roads and back paths he had explored during the day to avoid detection. Mika would stay close to him, silent and alert. If anyone appeared unexpectedly, they would have to remain calm and act naturally. Above all, John reminded himself to keep Mika safe. Her well-being was the priority over everything else. By late evening, the sky was a deep navy, sprinkled with countless stars. The air was crisp and quiet, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of the fair. John approached Mika and spoke softly. "We're going to move soon. You need to stay close to me and follow my instructions exactly. I promise, nothing will hurt you if we stick to the plan." Mika nodded, gripping the edge of the blanket around her shoulders, her eyes wide but trusting. John could see the tension in her body, but he also saw determination, an understanding that escape meant freedom, and freedom was worth the risk. The journey to the fairgrounds was long and tense. John led Mika through narrow paths and across open fields, careful to avoid any signs of movement that might indicate someone was watching. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, heightened their alertness. Mika flinched occasionally, but John whispered encouragement, reminding her to stay calm and to keep moving steadily. When they arrived at the edge of the fairgrounds, John paused. He studied the area carefully, noting the location of guards, entrances, and potential escape routes. He also checked the ropes that had previously restrained Mika's hands, making sure she was comfortable and able to move freely if necessary. Then, with a quiet nod, he guided her toward the first obstacle, the enclosure, where she had been kept during the fair. The gate was simple but secured with a small latch. John crouched and gently opened it, motioning for Mika to step through. Mika's heart raced as they moved inside. She had been here before, but this time, it was different. John's presence was a reassurance she had never experienced. He whispered instructions softly. "Stay close to me. Watch your step. We're almost out." Mika followed, her steps light but careful, her eyes darting to every corner in case someone was watching. She could feel the freedom within reach, but she also felt the fear that had accompanied her for so long. The next challenge was the main path that led out of the fairgrounds. John had noticed earlier that security was minimal at night, but he also knew that one careless move could draw attention. He led Mika through shadows, using the terrain to their advantage. They crouched behind stalls, moved along fences, and avoided open spaces whenever possible. Every step required focus, patience, and careful observation. At one point, a guard appeared unexpectedly, walking along the main path with a lantern. John froze and whispered, "Stay very still and follow me closely. Don't make a sound." They waited, hearts pounding, as the guard's light passed only a few feet away. Mika's breathing was shallow, but she did not panic. John's calm presence gave her the courage to remain silent and move only when it was safe.
Once the guard passed, they continued, each step bringing them closer to freedom.
Finally, they reached the outskirts of the fairgrounds. John had planned for this moment, bringing a small vehicle hidden behind trees to carry them quickly to a safer location. Mika climbed in quietly, her body still tense from the long journey but relieved to see a clear path ahead. John started the engine, careful not to make noise that could attract attention. As they drove away, the lights of the fair faded in the distance, and a sense of relief began to settle over both of them. Even though they were away from immediate danger, John knew their journey was far from over. Mika needed a safe place where she could recover physically and emotionally. He drove toward a secluded area on his ranch, a part of the property far from prying eyes, where he could set up a temporary shelter. Along the way, he spoke softly to Mika, keeping her calm and helping her understand that she was no longer alone. She listened, occasionally speaking in a quiet voice, telling him small details about her journey and her fears. John responded with reassurance, letting her know that her voice mattered and that she was in control now. When they reached the ranch, John guided Mika to the barn he had prepared days earlier. The familiar space provided comfort, and Mika allowed herself to relax slightly. John set out food and water, making sure everything was ready for her. He also lit lanterns to provide gentle light and checked the area for safety. He wanted her to feel secure, knowing that no one could reach her here. Throughout the night, John stayed near Mika, listening to her quietly as she recounted small pieces of her story. She told him about the places she had been moved to, the people who had controlled her, and the strategies she had developed to survive. John listened with patience and empathy, understanding that hearing her story was just as important as planning the next steps of her rescue. Every word she shared was a step toward healing and a step toward justice. By the time the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, John had developed a clearer plan for ensuring Mika's long-term safety. He intended to contact law enforcement discreetly, sharing the details he had gathered and arranging for an official investigation. At the same time, he wanted to prepare Mika for the possibility of leaving the ranch temporarily, ensuring she was ready to face the challenges ahead. John understood that trust, patience, and careful planning were crucial for the success of the rescue and for Mika's well-being. The experience had changed John. What had begun as a simple desire to help had grown into a mission, a responsibility he could not ignore. He had witnessed courage in Mika, and he had discovered strength within himself he had never known. The rescue was not just about escaping the fairgrounds, it was about restoring freedom, dignity, and hope. As they settled into the barn for another day, John spoke quietly to Mika, You've been incredibly brave. We're going to make sure you're safe, and we'll get justice for what happened to you. I promise. We'll do this together." Mika looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear, hope, and trust. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that she could be free, that she could have a life beyond fear. And in that quiet barn on the edge of the plains, John and Mika prepared for the next stage of their journey. A journey that would test courage, ingenuity, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. They knew challenges lay ahead, but for the first time, hope was no longer just a dream. It was something they could reach for, step by step, together. The first light of morning stretched over the horizon, painting the wide plains with shades of gold and orange. John Fletcher watched as the soft sunlight touched the barn, reflecting off the wooden walls and casting long shadows across the floor. Mika sat quietly on the straw mat, her eyes alert but calmer than they had been when they first arrived at the ranch. The night had been long, but it had also been a turning point. For the first time, Mika felt a sense of safety, and John knew the next steps were crucial for her long-term freedom. John had spent hours planning. He knew they could not stay hidden forever. The captors who had brought Mika to the fair could still be looking for her, and the authorities would need to be involved to ensure her protection. He also knew that Mika needed emotional support, reassurance, and preparation to face the coming challenges. John spoke gently, explaining the plan for the day. "We're going to contact the sheriff," he said. "I've gathered all the information we have. We'll tell him everything, and he'll make sure you're safe and that those who did this are held accountable." Mika listened quietly. Her voice was still soft, and her words came slowly, but there was a hint of determination in them. "Do you think they'll take me away again?" she asked, her eyes reflecting fear and uncertainty. John shook his head gently. "No," he said firmly. "This time it will be different. You'll be with people who are on your side, and I'll be with you. You won't have to face them alone." By mid-morning, John had made the call to the local sheriff's office. He explained the situation carefully, emphasizing the urgency and the need for discretion. He described the fair, the organizers, and everything Mika had told him about her captivity. The sheriff listened attentively and assured John that a team would be sent immediately to investigate and secure Mika's safety. John felt a sense of relief. He knew that law enforcement involvement was essential, but he also knew that the human element, patience, trust, and reassurance, was just as important. While waiting for the authorities to arrive, John focused on keeping Mika calm. They walked around the ranch, taking in the open fields, the gentle sounds of animals, and the warm sun on their faces. John spoke about simple things: cattle, the seasons, and the quiet beauty of the plains, helping Mika reconnect with the ordinary world she had been denied for so long. He wanted her to understand that life could be safe and steady, that freedom was not just an abstract idea but something she could experience every day. Mika began to open up more. She shared stories of her past, the places she had been moved to, and the fears she had carried silently for years. She also spoke about her family and her community, people who had likely been searching for her. John listened carefully, offering reassurance and empathy, validating her feelings and giving her space to express herself. Each word she spoke was a step toward healing, and John felt honored to witness her courage and resilience. By early afternoon, the sheriff's team arrived. John met them at the edge of the ranch, explaining the situation and guiding them to Mika. The officers approached with care, showing respect and understanding. Mika observed the team silently, her body tense but her eyes curious. John spoke to her softly. "They're here to help. You're safe now. You can trust them." Mika nodded slightly, her trust in John helping her extend that trust to the new faces. The officers carefully documented Mika's story, recording every detail she could share. They assured her that the captors would be investigated, and that steps would be taken to ensure her safety and protection. John stayed by her side throughout the process, providing support and acting as a bridge between Mika and the authorities. He knew that her voice needed to be heard, and he helped her feel empowered to speak about her experiences, knowing that doing so was part of reclaiming her freedom. Once the official steps were underway, John and Mika returned to the barn. Mika's shoulders were less tense, and her expression showed a mix of relief and cautious hope. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider a future beyond fear and captivity. She asked John questions about life on the ranch, the animals, and the daily routines that had once seemed ordinary but now represented stability and safety. John answered each question patiently, reinforcing the idea that Mika could build a new life, one where she had control and agency over her choices. As the day wore on, John reflected on the journey that had brought them here. What had begun as a simple day at a fair, an event meant to celebrate his cattle, had transformed into something far greater. He had faced uncertainty, risk, and moral responsibility, and he had chosen to act with courage and compassion. In doing so, he had not only helped Mika, but had also discovered the depth of his own character and the power of standing up for what is right. In the days that followed, arrangements were made for Mika to reconnect with her family and community. John accompanied her to meet with support personnel who helped reunite her with relatives who had been searching for her for years. The emotional reunion was a testament to resilience and the human capacity for hope. Mika's family expressed gratitude to John, acknowledging the critical role he had played in ensuring her safety and guiding her to freedom. John watched as Mika embraced her family, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that his actions had made a tangible difference in someone's life. He realized that true reward was not measured in trophies, recognition, or money, but in the ability to stand up for another person, to protect them, and to restore their dignity. Even after Mika was safely reunited with her family, John's life had changed. He returned to his ranch, carrying the memories of the rescue, the trust he had built, and the courage he had witnessed in Mika. He continued his work with cattle and the land, but he also carried a deeper understanding of human resilience, empathy, and the impact one person can have when they choose to act with compassion. John and Mika remained in contact, their bond strengthened by the shared experience. Mika thrived in the care of her family, supported by her community, and empowered to rebuild her life. John found satisfaction in knowing that he had played a role in restoring hope and safety to someone who had endured unimaginable hardship. Looking back, John reflected on the journey. He realized that life is unpredictable, often presenting challenges that test courage, morality, and empathy. What had seemed like a simple ambition to win recognition at a fair had become a transformative experience, teaching him that true bravery is not about facing physical danger alone, but about acting to protect others, even when it is difficult or inconvenient. Mika's freedom was a reminder of the power of human connection and the importance of standing up for what is right. John understood that the small, everyday acts of kindness, patience, and courage could change lives in ways that trophies or awards never could. And as he returned to his routine on the ranch, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that he had helped someone reclaim their life and dignity. The plain stretched endlessly before him, calm and golden in the late afternoon sun. John stood at the edge of his property, looking out at the horizon, feeling a quiet pride. Not for the fair or the recognition he had sought, but for the courage he had found within himself and the trust he had earned from someone who had needed it most. Mika's journey to freedom was complete, but the impact of that day, the choices made, and the lives touched would resonate forever. John understood that true victory is not measured in awards or applause, but in the lives we touch, the courage we show, and the kindness we extend to others. He had entered a fair hoping to celebrate his cattle, and he had emerged having changed a life forever. In helping Mika, John had discovered a deeper sense of purpose, one that would guide him for the rest of his life. And he knew that this story, the story of courage, trust, and freedom, would remain with him always.